Amen. Amen. Is that anybody's testimony this morning? I made it through. We used to say danger seen and unseen. There were some things that came after us that we did not even know was there, but we made it through. The Lord God flanked us on our left and our right, in front of us and behind us from dangers unseen. So my testimony, your testimony is, I made it through. I want to use Nehemiah chapter 3 as we continue to work through that particular book, the record that Nehemiah left for us, and that we will be studying as a congregation next month, starting next month as we go through for a few months the book in our small group studies. And I guess there's a fundamental question that I'm asking today that hopefully will resonate throughout what I want to share. And that is, have you ever needed anybody in your life? And so I want to use as a subject, stand next to me. That's what I'm hoping we will all consider together today. Do you have a memory as a child from your childhood, being a teenager, a young adult, or an older adult, when you asked someone to stand next to you? Do you remember that moment, that situation? It may have been because you wanted their support. You wanted the strength of their presence. Or you may have just wanted them to share in an experience that you were having. And conversely, has someone asked you, or impliedly asked you, to stand with them or to stand next to them as they were going through? Did they stand when you asked? Did you stand when they asked you? This matter of standing next to someone can be either standing based on a physical distancing, or it can be an emotional presence. That you can stand next to me even if you are not there physically next to me. Whether or not you know it or are willing to admit it, we all need people to stand next to us in our lives. If you're building, rebuilding, repairing your life, your reputation, your relationships, your marriage, going through sickness or any other weighty situation, you need someone to stand next to you. Nehemiah 3, the chapter at which we have arrived today, is really about what happens when God's people pull together. Among the long list of names of individuals and families, you will see that they were charged with building and restoring and rebuilding and repairing sections of Jerusalem's wall that had been broken down and gates that had been burned by enemies. Nehemiah, as you read this chapter, and don't get lost now with the list of names. Stay with the names. And as you read this chapter, you will discover that Nehemiah repeatedly uses words like next to him, next to them, after them, indicating that they were, as building and rebuilding and restoring, that they were doing the work standing next to each other. And when he speaks about the gates, there is this phrase that Nehemiah uses that captured my attention. He says, they laid its beam, they hung its doors with its bolts and with its bars. You see, the idea was that not only would they finish, because this was at least the second time an effort had been made to fix the walls and the gates, but they wanted to make sure that the end result was it would be strong and it would be able to weather whatever might come at them, because as they were burning down the gates and as they broke the wall, those on the outside were trying to get in to whatever was on the inside. And this time they wanted to make sure that it would not fall. Laid the beams, hung the doors with its bolts and beams, that these were elements that were used to hold up the sections of the walls and the gates that had been burned down. If you read that chapter, you will see that there were 10 gates. 10 gates. Those were the gates which they laid the beams and hung the doors using bolts and bars. 10 gates. 10 gates that were around Jerusalem, meaning that there were 10 different ways that people could enter and exit Jerusalem to worship. When I read that, it dawned on me that I wonder how many gates do we have, David Chapel, for entering to worship and exiting to worship? How many different ways do the people who want to come into our Jerusalem, how many different ways do they come in? Because not everybody comes in the gate the same way. Nor do all people come in the same gate. And so part of what we have to process is, are there gates that need to have the beams laid? Are there gates that need to be fixed so that those who want to enter can enter? How many ways can people come in this house to worship? That's what they were doing, going into Jerusalem to worship. And when we try to force everybody to enter and exit through the same gate, we've got a problem. Thanks be to God, God didn't make everybody like me. Thanks be to God, he didn't make everybody like you. Each of us is different, and we have, for whatever reason, we want to enter this way or that way. 10 different ways to enter and exit worship. How many gates do we have? This is a question for those of you who are going to be studying. When you get to chapter 3 in your study, ask yourself, what are the gates? How many do we have? And ask yourself, what did the gates mean in Nehemiah's day? And what do they symbolize today for us? What does the water gate stand for? What does the sheep gate stand for? All 10 will be interesting to ask the question today. And there they were, shoulder to shoulder, next to him, next to them, along the way. They worked, each one completing his and her section, so that there would be no gaps, there would be no holes, there would be no vulnerabilities in the wall that would exist. They were together. They were unified in all of the work that they were doing. And when we think about the Christian life and the church, where there is brokenness within the walls of our lives and the church, and where we have gates where we allow people in or out, that for us, this journey is really about spiritually building, spiritually rebuilding, spiritually repairing, spiritually laying in our lives beams and installing bolts and bars that will help our structure and the way that people can get into our lives and the way God can work in our lives. That is part of what we must be doing, not only in our personal lives, but in the life of this church. And there is a need for us to be what? Next to each other. If you were to study the New Testament alone, you would discover that there are 59 one another terms that we who make up the church. There are 59 different things that are spoken of in the New Testament about one another. And Andy Stanley has this statement that I believe is accurate. He says the primary activity of the church was one anothering each other. That's part of the problem that we have in the local church, that we do not one another each other. And perhaps we have become even more sensitive to that during this COVID time when we need one another. There is no one I know who can handle, endure, and persevere through COVID without needing someone standing next to them. I don't care how tough you are. I don't care how strong you think you are. In this season, you need somebody to stand next to you. And if we are going to go about building and rebuilding and reimagining and restarting and reaching and refreshing followers of Jesus, in other words, make disciples, we need to stand next to one another. I'm wondering right now, I hope somebody's been convicted in this house, either in this room or on the social media platform, on YouTube or Facebook. I hope you're being convicted and asking yourself the question, are you standing next to someone, and are you allowing someone to stand next to you? And Nehemiah, I believe, in this 3rd chapter speaks to us saying that everybody ought to be inspired to work. Everybody. There is no one who should be exempt from being inspired to do the work that we need to do. Remember now in chapter 2, we see Nehemiah says to them, don't you see the conditions that we are in? Don't you see the trouble that we are in? Don't you see and recognize the disgrace that we have because we are representatives of God, because this city is God's city? Look at how it looks, both in a tangible way and an intangible way. The people's spirit is broken. Don't you see that there is work to do? The record that Nehemiah left us says the leaders and the workers enthusiastically replied, well, let us start rebuilding. I'm trying to find those among us who are the enthusiastic. I'm trying to find those among us who are so enthusiastic about the work that God has for us. that our enthusiasm is reflective of the etymology of the word, that we are in God. God is in us, and that being recognized enthuses out. Where are the enthusiastic ones? What does it look like when you see someone who is enthusiastic? Or do we think that in the church we need to be cool, calm, and collected? And so when you start this third chapter, you see that the high priest was involved, and the other priests, the main preacher and the other preachers were involved. And it says that it was a good work. It also says that it was a holy work, because notice now, as they were starting with rebuilding, the high priest dedicated what was starting. This work of rebuilding and reimagining and restoring is a holy work. It's a work for God, and that alone ought to be enthusiastic to us. It ought to make us excited that God has yet given us another opportunity to work for Him. There was a quote I read that says that your state of mind and attitude will undoubtedly affect other people. And when you can look on the bright side of life, you will inspire others to do the same. I'm wondering, do I see faces and people among us that are not enthusiastic, that they tend to look on the dark side rather than the bright side? And how does that affect others? Where is the bad apple in the bunch that's about to rot the other apples? Is there excitement about what God is doing and what God wants to do? Because no matter what goal you want to achieve, you need to surround yourself with people on a similar level to inspire and motivate each other. See, this idea of motivation and enthusiasm and being inspired to do God's work can be contagious. You can have one who's lit with a fire that starts a spark in the one that's next to her or him, and that's how it works in the church. That if you're going to have an enthusiastic work, if you're going to have an inspired work, there need to be people who are enthusiastic in their spirit, and they display that and demonstrate that around others so that the fire can get caught by the other ones. You see, you and I must do the good work of rebuilding spiritual walls and fixing the spiritual gates with the beams of scriptures, with the bolts of prayer, and with the bars of togetherness. You must do it with a gung-ho spirit. Let me hear you say gung-ho. Gung-ho spirit. Let me tell you why I say that to you. In World War II, there was a Marine general who observed the Chinese troops shouting a phrase, gung-ho. They did it in unison in order to synchronize their movements together. And they said it because it meant cooperate and, quote, working together. And so this general in World War II started the Marines to use this word, this phrase, gung-ho, to show they needed to be enthusiastic about whatever actions they were going to undertake. And don't you see that is a precursor in what the people, the leaders, and the workers with Nehemiah said? Because they said enthusiastically, gung-ho, let's start rebuilding. What I want to challenge us is that if you see somebody in David Chapel who's not enthusiastic, what are the two words you need to say? Oh, that's not even exciting there. Let me hear you. Gung-ho! When you see somebody walking around with their head down or seeing someone being negative and not getting on with the project, what do you need to say? Gung-ho! That will need to happen because there are those among us who would need to be a little tickled. You know you can't tickle yourself, don't you? Just try it. Reach over. You can't tickle yourself. One reason you can't tickle yourself, they say, is because the mind has already prepared you for the tickle that's coming. And so in order to be tickled, you need someone else to tickle you. And that's what we need in this gung-ho moment. That you need somebody who will tickle you to go and do the work in an inspired way. Now listen, I didn't tell you all in this room, and those are on our social media, don't you walk over to somebody and just start tickling them. Unless she's your wife. How many years have you been tickling now? How many? I didn't ask you months. 94 months. I didn't ask you months. I said years. Everybody ought to be inspired to work because everybody is invited to work. There's no one who is not invited to be a part of this effort of rebuilding, getting involved with a ministry. No one is excluded from being a part of a small group study and participating. And it's amazing to see when you read this third chapter who responded to the invitation. Not only did Nehemiah's people respond, but when you study the details of the chapter, you will see that people came from 8 different places within a 15 to 20 mile radius of the city of Jerusalem. That there were other folk who were not directly affected by the rebuilding who got on the team and who were part of the team. They came from different trades, they came from different backgrounds, they came from different locations, and all of these people who wanted to be a part of this were invited to do that. Do you not know that in this season of social media that we have people who are not part of us, who have bought into what they have heard and seen about us, and they send in their offerings and their tithes, and when we take on a project, they get a part of that. We are seeing this ourselves. Everybody is invited to do the good work. And God has called us to be faithful over a few things. I don't know about you, but I want to hear those words, well done, thou good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. Come on higher. You see, I need to tell you, there is a place for everyone. There is a peace for everyone. That there is work that can be shared. Share the load. And then when you read the record of chapter 3, you see that there were some who did extra work. And we've got that around here. They might complain about it, but they do it. Because they want the walls and the gates built. And they don't want any gaps, and so they do the extra work. You see, Edmund Burke, a British statesman, said, nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he only could do a little. Just because you can give a little in time, talent, and money, give the little. Everybody can have a piece of the project. Deacon Emerson, equal sacrifice, if not equal amounts. Everybody can have a part in it. What would happen, my friends, if we work together? What would show up? What could happen if we work together? I read an article about a couple in Bruno, Nebraska. about 60 miles west of Omaha. They bought this property in a rural area that had a barn. Whenever the creek nearby would flood, then the barn would flood. So they decided they were tired of that, and they wanted to move the barn. They calculated the size and the weight of it all and estimated there was about 10 tons to move the barn from where it was to higher ground. The man calculated that of these 10 tons, if he could get 350 people, each of whom would lift 56 pounds, they could move the 10-ton barn. So the community had a celebration, and they extended an invitation to those who were there, and they ended up getting 350 people who moved the barn 115 feet south and 6 feet higher to another slope and set it on its new foundation. You see, it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of folk if you will plan and calculate, just like Nehemiah did. Nehemiah looked at that place and he determined what he needed each one to do. 350 people moved the barn. Certainly, we can embrace the team spirit together. Each achieves more. And not just move barns, but enthusiastically move mountains. All we need is those who are invited to come on and be a part of it. That's what Jesus said, Matthew 21:21. If you have that kind of faith, that faith can move mountains. I need some mountain movers. I need people who don't yet see it, but because of faith, they want to do it. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not. I need some mountain movers who are already invited to do the work because they are also inspired to work. And with that said, everybody should be involved by working. Nobody ought to be sitting down. Because to rebuild and to build and to redo after you have been affected by COVID, and COVID has people fearful of worshiping together and coming to the house of worship, and people are disengaged from being involved in Bible study and Sunday school and prayer meeting, that there is something that needs to be done, and there's a place for everybody. Even on Wednesday nights when we are praying, if you don't have Zoom, call in. There's a telephone number. You can pray. You can be a part of it. Do you not know that the circumference of the wall and gates was approximately 2.5 miles? Some 220 acres. That was what the project covered. It was a big job. And Nehemiah knew that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. The question for each of us today is, and you? Do you see your involvement or not? You see, this is what I've learned over the years. Nehemiah's example. When I read that 3rd chapter, it says that some refused to work. Must have been David Chapman. Invited. Everybody can be a part, but they refused to work. And he, like me, we've learned to go with the willing workers. You can't let those who refuse to become too much of a focus where the project gets stopped. And so here is Nehemiah going with those who were willing to do this. And the way he did it was he had them together by families. He had them together by vocations. And he had them together by location. Because there were those, when they cooperated with one another, they repaired what was near where they were. In other words, if they were involved in a ministry, they didn't worry about getting to another ministry. They repaired their own ministry. The record says the high priest was hands-on. The other priests were hands-on. The leaders were hands-on. The church staff, the temple staff, the Levites, the servants, people who were not leaders, both men and women, and business people who were merchants, who were goldsmiths, who were perfume manufacturers, and then there were the outsiders. All of them were involved in the project. And remember, Christians, the Bible tells us in the New Testament that we are one body, but different, with different parts depending on each other. You need to be standing next to somebody in this season, and somebody needs to stand next to you. You need to learn that in your individuality, you may not be able to do much, but together. That's why the Bible tells us in Proverbs, look at the ant. Learn from the ant's ways and be wise. You see, the ant individually has its own strengths and capabilities. And when you study the ants, you will learn that they work together to accomplish seemingly impossible feats. Their major advantage appears to be the way they are organized, and the whole ant colony brings to bear what each ant brings and gets it done. If you study ants, there are worker ants, there are army ants, there are all different types of ants that bring their own uniqueness to the task. I'm just trying to tell somebody in here, you got something that you can bring to the task of getting it done. I don't know if you've ever paid attention to the Northeast, and maybe last year about the storm and snow, how snow works. Do you know that snowflakes are frail? Yeah. But if enough of them stick together, they can stop traffic. I need some snowflakes. I need some mountain movers. I need some gung-ho folk to get the project done. As I close, I know you're wondering, when is he going to close? I'm about to close. I like Henry Ford's statement. Henry Ford says, coming together is a beginning. Staying together is progress. Working together is success. Nehemiah and his workers, as we'll see in this preaching series, kept together, working at it, and got the job done. So what's your reward for involvement? Your reward for your involvement is the same reward that those who organized this church in 1924 got. It's the same reward that all of those over almost 100 years before us got from their involvement. Here we are now, from 1924 to 2022. And there were those who stood in the same place that you and I are standing right now. And that is, if you work together without conflict, you can leave behind you something that will outlive your days. That you are pouring into something that's bigger than you, that's representative of God, And all you need to do is do your part today for those who will come after you. There will be others. This church will survive me and survive you. I'm number 7 pastor. There'll be some other pastors. There'll be some other members. There'll be some other musicians. There'll be some other deacons. There'll be some other ushers who will come and stand next to one another in this house, because Revelation says that your good works will follow you. Revelation 14:13 says it this way: those who die in the Lord, their good works will follow them. What's going to follow you when I or some other preacher stands over your body and speaks of your good works? Jesus said, I must work the work of him who sent me while it's day. And we, as Jesus followers, we've got our own assignments that we need to work. Well, let the life I live speak for me. May the work I do speak for me. And may the service I give speak for me.